Now, there is a controversial new book called The War on Whites. The author is with us now. His name is Ed Brodow, and he is the author of this book. And he says it looks into, as he puts it, the anti-white racial inquisition that is poisoning America. Ed, you're very welcome to talkTV this afternoon. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Peter?
I'm very well, Ed. Thank you. Tell me what this book argues, what your thoughts are on this. And it's pretty controversial. Lots of people will disagree with you. What would you say to them?
Well, it's controversial because when we think of racism, we're accustomed to thinking of whites being racist toward blacks. But the tables have been turned. And now it's whites that are being bullied racially. Whites are being demonized. People are saying whites are evil. Whites are oppressors. That everything that whites have accomplished is terrible and should be destroyed. So all of the scientific advances that we've made, Western civilization...
Who's saying that, though, Ed? Honestly, who's saying that? Who's saying that whites are all bad people?
It's coming from the left, and it's coming... Well, I'll give you two examples. One is you have these diversity trainings that corporations and government agencies are imposing on their white employees, where they're literally telling them to undo their whiteness. And this is going on all over the country. And the other thing is students in school, as young as 5 and 6, are being told that they're flawed if they happen to be white. If you're white, there's something wrong with you.
I don't think anybody should be made to feel guilty because of an accident of birth. But clearly there is still huge racism in this country and in your country, in America as well. Clearly there are many people who are discriminated against for lots of reasons, including being black, for example, or Hispanic or whatever. I mean, that still exists, doesn't it?
Well, let's face it, it will always exist. There will always be some...
Doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do something about it, though, does it?
Well, here's the thing. They talk about systemic racism. And in the war on whites, I argue that systemic racism no longer exists. 50 years ago, we enacted civil rights legislation, and the changes in the last 50 years have been immense. So that while we may have had systemic racism 50, 60 years ago, we don't have it anymore. Blacks and Hispanics and other minorities can do whatever they want. They can get, there's no trouble getting a job. If you're black, you can get a job, you can be admitted to college, you're given preferences. So to say that there is such a thing as white supremacy and systemic racism in 2023 is just purely wrong.
But all employees do diversity training, not just white people, for example. And also, just because there's legislation in place, and it has been, and you know, Lyndon Johnson brought a lot of that in the 60s, just because there is legislation doesn't mean there aren't exceptions to that as well.
Well, as I said, there will always be some sort of racism, but the environment in the United States is so different today than it was in 1960.
But that's good. That's fine. I'm happy with that. I don't want it to be like the 1960s in America. In the 1960s in America were awful. People were being lynched for their color.
Well, you know, it's important to understand that we are where we are now, not where we were then. And when they talk about reparations, for example, slavery is ancient history. The people that want these things want to be compensated for something that happened to their great-great-great-grandparents. Today, if Shelby Steele, for example, who is a black author, brilliant black author, says that if you're black today, you can do anything you want. You can be a movie star. You can be a doctor. You can be an airline.
There are definitely examples of people who, you know, we've had a president of the United States who's black, for example. We've had lots of people who have not let any disadvantage in their life bring them back, but there's still huge levels of poverty, for example, lack of opportunity in so many parts of America. I spent the last little while a few weeks ago. I was in Selma, Alabama. I was in Birmingham, Alabama. I was in Atlanta. I mean, these are great places, but there are still clearly major problems in terms of race in America. It's still a vast issue. I was in Texas, where there was a Confederate flag, and someone had written on the Confederate flag, had written on the Confederate flag, "Heritage, not hate." you know, this is still a massive problem.
I would argue that that is a fringe. The problem today is that the media do not tell the public what's really happening. They don't tell the public that there is a war on whites. And that's why people need to read my book.
Who
find out what's really going on.
Who's in charge of this war on whites? And I mean, it's interesting you mentioned there, just in terms of the of slavery. I don't think there's too many people who would argue that that wasn't a horrendous thing. And it is possible to accept that racism is wrong, as I do. There were historic awful events, obviously. Practices like slavery were abhorrent. But you can accept all that without feeling guilt, can't you?
Yeah, but see, my view is that racism is racism, whether you aim it at blacks or Hispanics or whites. And racism, discrimination against whites, is just as bad as discrimination against blacks. And we need to face up to the fact that there is an epidemic of anti-white racism right now.
But what is it? What can you? Okay, let's take your argument and say that there is an epidemic of anti-white racism. What can you not do at the moment because you're white?
What can I not do?
Yeah, what have you been discriminated against doing?
There are government jobs that I can't get. There are government programs that I'm not eligible for. There are colleges that will not allow me to participate in certain programs. There are a plethora of things that I can't do because I'm white. And that is just as wrong as when you have blacks being subjected to that kind of treatment.
But the point of affirmative action programs in America is to try to level the playing field, because it isn't a level playing field at the moment. Even still, you say, look, slavery's ancient history. It was a long time ago, but we're still in a situation where a lot of people in America certainly are not getting the same opportunities, don't have the same access to funding, don't have the same access to the standard of education, for example. There are exceptions to this, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. But in general, if you're born as, say, let's talk about Birmingham, Alabama. If you're born as a black boy in Birmingham, Alabama, you're more likely to go to prison than to Harvard.
That is another issue entirely, and it has to do with black criminality. Blacks are not being put in prison because of racism. They're being put in prison because of the huge amount of criminality that is rampant in the black community. Blacks commit something like 8 times as many murders as whites. So the argument that blacks are the object of racism and therefore they're going to jail, that's a false argument.
Do you honestly believe black people are have more propensity to commit crime?
Do I honestly believe? Yeah, read my book.
Okay, sorry, Ed, I'm sorry, that's where we differ. I'm sorry, I'm ending the interview. I can't continue this conversation. Apologies, Ed. Thank you very much indeed to Ed. I just can't.